I see I see several people joining, and so I think this is a good time to start. We're so excited to hold this chat with Alexander today, and we just want to welcome you to this event. Just as an initial pitch, Ezra has told me that, in the signups that we received, we noticed that a lot of folks who registered are not members of AABA. And so we just want to put in a pitch for you to sign up and become a member of AABA. You can do so by signing up through the AABA website. Another thing that we want to do in this introduction is just to ask all the folks who are on this call, if you could introduce yourselves by putting your name and preferred pronouns in the chat, just so that Juicy and Alexander can get a sense of, who's joining us today and who's joining us in the audience. I think, oftentimes with these Zoom video conferences, it feels very impersonal and we don't get a chance to interact and interface with each other as much. But, just putting your names and your preferred pronouns in the chat would just do us the great service of just understanding and getting a sense of who's in the audience. And I see folks are doing that now, so we really appreciate it. So I'm going to start off with introducing our moderator, our fabulous host, our hostess with the mostest today, Juicy Liu. Juicy is a drag entertainment activist living in San Francisco. Juicy found her voice as an activist when she became Miss GAPA 2016 for the GLBTQ plus Asian Pacific Alliance. Juicy launched her podcast, Juicy Thoughts. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Juicy Thoughts or Juicy Tots, in 2020 to interview LGBTQ public figures and find out their hidden hobbies and private passions. Juicy brings her message of visibility, representation, and positive identity wherever she goes. Juicy is the alter ego of Michael Nguyen, a patent attorney who specializes in computer and software-based inventions. Besides serving on the boards of Livable City and Bay Area Lawyers for Individual Freedom, Bailiff, Michael also serves as the chair of GAPA, or GAPA. I never know with these acronyms what the right pronunciation is, but awesome organization. A 33-year-old nonprofit that envisions a powerful queer and trans Asian Pacific Islander QTAPI community that is seen, heard, and celebrated. Follow Juicy on Instagram and Facebook or Venmo even. The Venmo handle, I think, is Juicy Liu Realness, Liu spelled I-L-I-U. And we're so excited to have Juicy host this excellent event today.
Thank you, Christina. And also I'd like to share my thanks for the AABA LGBTQ committee for hosting this event, and Bailiff for co-sponsoring this event, and for Reed Smith for sponsoring this amazing conversation. We're here in the middle of QTAPI Week, the first ever QTAPI Week in the United States. San Francisco basically declared it. So I want to make sure to say happy QTAPI Week. We're so excited, and I'm actually one of the co-founders of this Bay Area QTAPI Coalition and the lead organizer for QTAPI Week. It's my honor to introduce our special guest for this evening. And I'm going to use my best Gaysian Oprah voice, so don't mind me because I'm living my fantasy, okay? Alexander Chen is the founding director of the Harvard Law School LGBTQ plus Advocacy Clinic. Alexander's work focuses on expanding the rights of LGBTQ plus people through impact litigation, policy advocacy, and direct representation at both the national and local levels. He also teaches gender identity, sexual orientation, and the law at the law school. Alexander received his BA from Oxford University, his MA from Columbia University, and his JD from Harvard Law School, where he was the first openly transgender editor of the Harvard Law Review, and worked on trans issues at the Department of Justice, the ACLU LGBT and HIV Project, and the National Center for Transgender Equality. He clerked on the Ninth Circuit for the Honorable M. Margaret McCowan, and in the Southern District of California for the Honorable Gonzalo P. Curiel. Welcome to the Zoom stage, Alex Chen. Yay. Welcome. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you for that very sweet introduction.
Yeah. So we're gonna basically do this format of maybe about an hour or so of chat between the two of us in conversation. Christina and Amanda on the LGBTQ committee will be kind of monitoring the chat and seeing if questions pop up, and we want to make this as interactive as possible. So if questions pop up, put it in the chat or message Christina or Amanda, and they'll pop on to interrupt us wherever we are. But first of all, and then we'll reserve 30 minutes at the end for a Q&A as well. I first want to kick it off to Alex to sort of just share a story of when did you maybe first become an activist? Do you identify as an activist? And
Yeah, actually, that's kind of a funny thing. I didn't quite.
Okay, cool. Do over.
Are we okay? All right. So what I was going to say is I didn't quite expect you to ask that because actually I think that, a lot of my activism when I was young was actually really centered around the fact that I was born in the United States, but when I was a teenager, my mother and I actually moved to Hong Kong, where she took an academic teaching position. And while I was there, so I was there between when I was 10 to 17, and that was also during the period of time in which the Iraq War. Really, 9/11 occurred while I was in Hong Kong, and then, the build up to the Iraq War. And it's simultaneously, there was also a lot of activism in Hong Kong at that time around democracy protests and around the sort of ongoing struggle of Hong Kong to sort of be involved in democratic self-governance, right? And so actually, when I was young, I participated in some of the street protests that occurred at that time over sort of issues like the ability of the Hong Kong government to determine its own educational curriculum, whether or not people could be detained under certain conditions. I volunteered for the Hong Kong Human Rights Monitor and sort of, participated in sort of trying to lobby legislative council members in Hong Kong over democracy activism. And so actually I kind of really came of age at a time when there was a lot of fervent around international politics and around sort of American imperialism and around, the impact that America's actions have around the world, right? And actually, what was really eye-opening for me, having that experience as an American, was really just seeing the vast difference in the way that our actions are perceived domestically here versus abroad. And I remember, really being struck by the difference in different kinds of English language reporting about, for example, the buildup on the war in Iraq and whether, in fact, Saddam Hussein had WMDs from like American newspapers versus British versus Australian and other sources. And so I really came actually from a background of that type of activism. And I think that, frankly, like a lot of people around me, I think my family were really scared that I would decide to do that with my life and that I would get disappeared or executed or one of the many things that happen to people who try to agitate for democracy or civil rights in, authoritarian parts of the globe. And so, I often think about that because I think, there's a lot of struggle. There's a lot of challenge, of course, to doing LGBT rights work in the States. We're facing an unprecedented wave of attacks against transgender people in the state legislatures. We're facing, the violence and discrimination and inability to receive housing and employment that a lot of transgender people face in this country, especially Black and brown folks and trans women of color. But, I also don't sort of wake up every day wondering if this is the day that I'm going to get surrounded by my country's security forces and taken away. And so I'm really grateful for that experience because I think it gave me perspective on the fact that we still have this opportunity here to do social reform work. We have a civil society. We have some norms of rule of law that still hold in this country. And I feel sort of grateful every day that I can do the work that I'm passionate about here in this country under relatively safe conditions. And it really shapes how I think about the advocacy work I do here in domestic terms as well.
Well, thank you for that. And I just want to set an intention here in my very openness to really kind of showcase the different kinds of activism that's possible in the LGBT community and to really think about a lens of Asian American and Pacific Islander, heritage on top of that. LGBTQ plus advocacy. So I really want to dig in a little bit. Did you always want to be a civil rights lawyer though, Alex?
I mean, so I think that little précis, right? I mean, I think I was a little bit of a crusader. You know, I was maybe not that much fun when I was a kid because I was the kid that could...
I mean, you're like 10 and you're talking about like pro-democracy, right?
That's exactly right. So, you know, I'm the one who's like, you know, waving the newspaper around like, did you see this? And all my friends are like, what are you even talking about? Did you see that Friends marathon, right? And so maybe I wasn't so much fun when I was a kid for that reason. But I think I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And I think what ended up happening for me is, you know, I went to college and I ended up going to college in Britain because I went to a British international school. I got into a British university. I wanted to go and study English literature, which is another passion of mine. I just really love, you know, reading and books. And so I thought I'm just going to go and have an adventure and see what happens, right? And I thought maybe I'll end up going back to the States. So I want to kind of see Europe. I want to kind of have that kind of different cultural experience. And, you know, I didn't really know exactly what I was going to do for a living. And of course, I think as an Asian kid who grew up in a pretty stereotypical East Asian household in some ways in terms of stressing academic achievement, I think, you know, my family were very much on the like lawyers, doctors, engineers kind of train. And so I think there was always this background presumption of like, you're going to go to college and then you might fritter around with like what you do for your undergrad, but later you're going to go to professional school. But I really resisted that. And in fact, I never thought I would end up being an attorney. I was like, I'm never going to do that. I'm not going to walk that road. I'm going to go do something else. But what ended up happening was that after I graduated from college, I moved back to Asia for a while. And I realized that I was trans while I was living in East Asia in my as a young adult, right? And so I was, I think, 21 at the time, or maybe even, I think I was 21 when I sort of just realized that I was trans. And I think on some level, I maybe knew it before then, but I think growing up in Hong Kong at that time, there really weren't any role models for transgender people other than being a sex worker or some kind of performer. And that was only transgender women. And it was something that people derided and sort of, it was a joke, right? People never really thought about it. They talked about it like, you know, the bearded lady at the circus is the way that people talked about, you know, trans performers in places like Thailand. And so, you know, I couldn't see myself in the way that people talked about transgender people as a young person. And then when I got to college, I think I met my first transgender person in person ever at the LGBT Society. And, you know, I think that on some level, I was really like amazed that that was something that was possible. But I also on some level thought, you know, I don't want to have to figure this out right now because, you know, I saw what a difficult time they had. And I saw how they were ostracized and I saw how they had to leave school for a while. And I thought, well, you know, I don't know how my parents would react to this. I have to get through and get my college degree. And after that, I can figure myself out. So I think on some subconscious level, I knew already, but I think that I wasn't prepared to deal with it for myself until after I felt like I was in a place of greater security, right? And so what ended up happening is I graduated from college at 21, went and lived in Singapore for a while. And it was there that I realized I was transgender. And then it was really this kind of immediate problem of like, okay, well, what on earth am I going to do about that? Right. And, you know, living in a country where I don't have legal citizenship and doesn't recognize the ability for people to legally or medically or socially transition in any way. And that's actually what brought me back to the United States. What ended up happening is I sort of looked up, okay, you know, how, you know, I'm just a recent college graduate with no job and no health care, and I live halfway around the world from where I want to be. How can I get there? And once I get there, how can I go on a path of being able to live authentically in myself? So I ended up deciding just out of the blue to go move to New York City because I went online and I looked up where can you get free legal services and medical services as a transgender person. And I found resources like the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, which full circle, I'm now working with some of the people who helped me all the way back then.
Wow.
You know, as a collaboration in the clinic. And I also ended up, you know, finding out that there were, you know, community healthcare resources at places like the LGBT Callan Lord Community Health Center, where I was able to, you know, pay a sliding scale and go and start getting access to care. And so I basically found an internship and a reason to move to New York City, and I just packed up and moved. Wow. And I kind of landed in New York City in 2010, literally knowing like no people in the city. And you know, what ended up taking me into being a lawyer was really that experience, you know, of like, I thought, you know, I had it rough, but, you know, within a couple of months, with the help of these different legal and health organizations that were in the community, I was really able to begin my path, you know, to sort of initiate a process of a legal name change, get access to the beginnings of gender affirming care. But I was also, you know, now in community with a lot of transgender people in the city who were having a much harder time than me, you know, who didn't have this educational capital that let them sort of like figure out which things they could navigate to get free services. And even if they had that educational capital, they were struggling with lots of other kinds of things that were impacting them, right? Intimate partner violence, family abuse, being unhoused, you know, all sorts of issues with, you know, employment and educational discrimination. And I was just, I think, you know, in a way, even though I was very idealistic when I was younger, you know, I was also relatively sheltered from kind of like just how hard it is to be marginalized and especially low income in a major city in the world. And I think that, you know, having that experience really opened my eyes to the fact that, you know, that it was profoundly unjust that I had a different kind of experience. Like my experience was hard enough, but my experience was so informed by the privilege I had through my education, right? And that so many other people who are just as smart, who are just as, you know, who were kinder than me, more generous than me, more empathetic than I was, more open-minded than I was, were all having a much harder time. And it wasn't fair that that was happening. And that's one thing to know intellectually. It's another thing for that to be your friends who you're at the support group with, or you're at the community event with, and you're seeing how hard they're struggling. You realize you can't help them. You can barely help yourself. And that was really the experience that shaped my decision to go to law school. Cause I thought, you know, like there's got to be something that somebody can do about this. And even those organizations that were so limited in their resources and were so limited in what they were able to do to help me, those organizations helped me so much. And so I thought, you know, I can do that. I can go to law school and I can figure out a way that I can help people in the community the way that I was helped.
Awesome. Well, that's amazing. It's so inspiring. And also I kind of want to touch on the law school element right now. Like, so you figured out you were trans in Singapore, you moved to New York, you kind of get access to some resources for name change, for, you know, legal and healthcare access, and then you make the choice to go to Harvard Law School. Was it like Legally Blonde? Like, was it like that's what I want to know. Like was it like, you know, cup chowder on the Cape, you know, what was it like to go to Harvard Law School as, you know, and to get onto the Law Review as a first trans editor? I mean, can you talk about that experience?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, they really hate that movie, I think, in the admissions office, because people send admissions videos even now.
Oh.
And that is not an official part of the application process. You know, they're not invited, but they still get them apparently. And the other thing that you may or may not know is that that movie was not actually filmed on the Harvard Law School campus, because Harvard never lets any movies get filmed on their campus. And so I think it's like some other law school. I don't know what, like BU or something like that. Okay. Anyway, long story short, so it's not even the right environment, but I will say that, you know, I've been really thinking about recently, like what my law school experience was like, because I have recently started teaching at the school that I went to as a law student. And I think that if you talked to me 4 years ago, or like when I'd recently graduated from law school, I think I still had Stockholm syndrome. And I would have been like, oh, it was pretty good, actually. It wasn't as bad as I expected. I mean, but to be honest, like now that I'm back, you know, I think they tried their hardest, but I think that, you know, it's really hard. It's a tough psychological environment for some different reasons. For me, I had a hard time because for most of the time that I was there, I was the only openly transgender student on campus. And in fact, I struggled a lot in my first year of law school with whether or not I should be out as trans, because I really had only recently started sort of being able to live authentically as a man without sort of people, you know, making a lot of assumptions about my gender identity. And I also was really worried that it would cause people to, you know, just only see like the scarlet T on my forehead. And that would be the only thing they thought about me. Oh, he's the trans one, right? And that's it. And I think even now, to some extent, you know, that is the way that some people still see me. But I think at the time I was really struggling with like this idea of like, I really want to be seeing the full complexity of my humanity and not just have this like T on my forehead all the time. So I think I actually had a kind of a hard time with kind of becoming comfortable with being open as myself. And then I think the other thing is that, you know, it was before I went to law school, before, you know, there was this huge wave of attention to the transgender community, which I think has both been a positive, mostly in a lot of ways, but of course, there are problems with hypervisibility. Yeah. But it was before, you know, the transgender tipping point and Orange is the New Black and Laverne Cox being on the cover of Time magazine, right? And so at the time, like what I thought I wanted to do with my legal career felt like so niche and so different than like what many of my fellow classmates wanted to do. And so I think I did feel kind of alienated from the environment and what most people's goals were.
Hmm.
And I sort of doubted, whether or not I could really be successful in trying to focus my career on advocating for trans folks and for the rest of, the queer community. So I think um, there are, there are some funny moments. Thinking back on it, like I remember when I got on Law Review, the Law Review has its own little separate building on campus called Gannett House, which is basically like the world's nerdiest and saddest frat house. um,
You
you
just
know,
like have the blue book on citations. That's like with
Totally right, and
the
it's like
tag.
it exists because of the Blue Book, right?
Yeah.
Because the HLR is one of the 4 institutions that still runs the Blue Book.
Oh.
And I remember, and that's where we get most of our money. And I remember I was one time I was sitting in the basement, which is an area where there was a little poker table, and apparently, Barack Obama used to play poker there with his friends back when he was on the Law Review, like a quarter of a century ago. And I remember sitting around the table, and there was this like excruciating experience that I had where some of the people at the time, I think some of the editors knew that I was trans and some of them didn't. And one of the other editors, who I think really like considered herself to be like this true blue liberal who wasn't afraid to say things that made other people uncomfortable and to challenge people's political opinions,
Yeah.
was like, here's a hypothetical. Would any of you ever date a transgender person?
Oh. Okay.
And then we were supposed to all go around in a circle and say whether or not we were going to date a transgender person, right? And it's like, if you can imagine, like it's a circle, there's like 20 people there, and like he's here and I'm like over here, and they're going this way, and so I'm like in the back third of the the group, and it's very awkward because everybody like kind of freezes because like they're all like, she doesn't know. Who knows? Like,
Oh,
and
yeah.
so they're all saying these like very like cagey things like, I think I'd be surprised, but it'd be okay, or something. And she was like, you're lying. There's no way you'd be okay with it. You'd never date one of those people. You're just trying to say that to be polite, but And it was just like, I felt like a deer on the headlights. Like I was like, oh, please, somebody just run me over right now. Get me out of this. But I was like frozen, and so finally it comes all the way around to me. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I think that would be great actually, because I'm trans, and if they told me they were trans, I think it would kind of make things easier.
Wow. Well done, Alex. That's I feel cringy right now for you.
Just to finish off the story, right? Like, many months later, she and I were walking back from another event, and she like turned to me and she said, look, I'm really, really sorry about that, because I realized afterwards that I was just saying that to try to make myself feel better than other people. And in fact, it never occurred to me that anybody who was trans could ever be in that room. And that's exactly what the problem is, right? Is that you make all these assumptions about who can be in the room and who isn't. And so actually she like straight up sincerely apologized to me. And sometimes people have said and done really crappy things, and they have not. And actually that was like really a growth moment, I think. And I think it just gave me this optimism of like, oh, like we can change things. Like things can change for the better. It might take time. It might be kind of hard. It might put people on the spot in a terrible way sometimes that isn't fair, but people can change. Hearts and minds can change. And so I think that was kind of my experience over time, that, it wasn't the easiest environment to be in always, but I'm glad that I went, and I'm glad that I did it, because I think it did affect how some people thought about trans folks who are in my class, and the people who go to this law school go to a lot of places where they're going to have a lot of power and control over other people's lives, right? And so I think that was the reason I went to that institution, and that's the reason I teach at that institution now. And I don't think that people should have to do that. I don't think people should have to be some kind of trailblazer. But at the same time, progress does require some level of visibility, and it does require some level of engagement. And I'm glad that that was an impact that I was able to have.
Yeah, I mean, Alex, it's hard to be the first, and you're a trailblazer, whether you like it or not. And so we're going to talk about identity, queer, trans, Asian, Pacific Islander identity later, movement building. But I want to first talk about your substantive work with trans rights and expanding, kind of just working in that space as a civil rights lawyer, doing impact litigation, doing policy advocacy. Can you talk more about sort of your experience with that? I mean, we can go on for hours, but just sort of like, we're trans rights are under attack, have been for a longest time, especially under the past administration. But like, is it getting better?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, during the time, that I was in law school and then clerking and then, working at the National Center for Lesbian Rights and now taking this job, there has been a tremendous amount of progress for trans rights, right? I mean, really, like I said at the beginning of the time that I wanted to do this work, none of the mainstream LGBT organizations had any significant transgender rights docket. When I went to summer at the ACLU LGBT Rights Project as a Rising 2L, they hadn't taken a transgender case since the Shore case, Shore v. Bulletin in 2010, and they didn't seem to have any active plans to take another case. Doctrinally, there had been a lot of brave trans folks who had, from the 70s onwards, tried to say that, it is sex discrimination to discriminate against us for being transgender in employment. But that had been rejected by many federal courts, right? And so, there were constant efforts by transgender attorneys and advocates to put us on the legal agenda. But at the same time, there had historically been a deprioritization of issues that affected trans folks, and a focus on other issues. And I think from that time to now, there has been some tremendous progress, right? I mean, I think that Bostock was a huge win for the transgender community. I think we've had significant wins in terms of expanding access to healthcare and preventing healthcare discrimination, and getting, protections in schools under Title IX. When it comes to, even some cases that we've worked on in the prison context, right? Like Edmo v. Corizon, which recognized that there can be a constitutional violation when you deny a transgender woman access to surgery in prison, as well as other cases that have worked on things like hormone access, the defeat of the transgender military ban. There have been a lot of policy victories, a lot of progress on identity documents and on people being able to change identity documents, on non-binary identity documents, and getting X on gender markers recognized. So I think, you look across the landscape, and objectively, trans folks have more protections and they have more of ability to live authentically than they did 10 years ago. At the same time, that visibility has come alongside a lot of sort of mainstream America sort of discovering that transgender people exist, even though transgender people have existed since time immemorial, and deciding that, this is all new and they don't understand it, and therefore, they should get involved, even though they don't understand it and it's been going on without them. And so, and I think of transgender people becoming the new political punching bag, right? So I think the other thing that we've really seen is that since 2015 and the passage of, since the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell, the right has given up on demonizing gay people. As, if you just think about the way that gay people were talked about in the late 90s, the early 2000s, Prop 8, gays were the wedge issue for a long time. Yeah. And they've just acted like that never even happened. Like, they just have amnesia about it. They've never apologized for any of the things that they did back then. And they've just turned around and done the exact same thing with a new group of people, right? And it's like, there's absolutely no shame in some of these folks whose careers have been made at places like the Heritage Foundation in writing about and fear-mongering about gay people and the fact that gay people would have on kids and on families. And none of that turned out to be true. And instead of engaging in any degree of self-reflection, they've turned around and written pretty much exact same books about transgender people, right? And so it's like, it's this really cynical kind of thing, because it's about a paycheck and it's also about winning political points, and it's about the fact that they don't have an affirmative policy agenda in other areas, so they're going to fight this culture war. And it's deeply horrible, because the people that they're focusing on now especially are kids.
Yeah.
And kids who are already so vulnerable, who are already so afraid of society's messages about transgender people, who have such an elevated rate of suicidality and who do so well when they're affirmed, those are now the political targets, right? And so there's just something really awful, as cynical as I am and as much as I've been in the arena, in the way that they are just so unrepentant about targeting the most vulnerable people in our society.
Yeah, that's so terrible. I mean, my gosh. I mean, but what stands out for me is the advocacy. Like, the children today who are trans kids having to go before the Texas state legislator and say, why are you hating, why do you want to hurt me? Or going to all the other state legislators, and just the coldness of it all, and just I can't understand, where's the humanity kind of thing, and can you talk about that, specifically protecting our trans kids? What can we be doing other than just hoping that advocates like you are going to win those cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so it sort of depends on your positionality. What is the right way to be supportive, right? So I think, for example, Texas, actually today, the news just came through, I don't know if you know, that all of the bills have died in committee that were anti-trans in Texas this season, right? Which is an amazing, huge win, which really is the result of the incredibly hard work and emotional labor of all of these kids and their families and advocates on the ground in Texas. Because what really works is not necessarily people coming in from out of state. and then it's like, oh, don't bring your California values to Texas,
Yeah.
or your New York values to Texas, or your Massachusetts values to Texas. It's, I'm from Texas and this is my kid, or I am in first grade here and here is my story. Like that is what is changing hearts and minds. And I think, I've actually it's both been really demoralizing how many of these bills there are. It feels like, it's like whack-a-mole. And also I have been pleasantly surprised at how few of them actually passed. And even that some conservative governors have tried to veto these bills, like the governor of Arkansas, on the grounds that it actually is against conservative values to interfere with families, to interfere with medical decision making. It's the nanny state, it's government overreach. So you can frame it in this kind of like conservative way of like, well, what on earth is the state even doing here? When, the medical associations and sports associations are already developing protocols, why are we stepping in? And so I think that in terms of if you live or work in those states, I think that there's a certain kind of way that you can engage. If you don't, though, I think there's still plenty to be done, right? And I think a lot of it is about multiple kinds of things. Like one is just like direct mutual aid, right? Just like donating to grassroots organizations that do this work on the front lines. They're very under-resourced compared to, state equality groups and grassroots organizations, especially organizations that really center Black and brown folks, are really under-resourced compared to like big nonprofit giants that everybody has heard of, right? So thinking about, when you are making your own contributions, like who are you donating to, and do you trust grassroots organizations to lead that are not vetted by foundations that necessarily sort of report in a traditional way according to grant metrics? Do you trust people on the ground who are in these communities to lead, right? I think that's one part of it. Another part of it, though, is thinking about how we can continue to improve things for transgender people, and especially transgender young people in the places that we live, because the fact of the matter is it's not easy anywhere you live. And what are we doing to look at the kinds of policies that we have in our neighborhood school districts, in educational institutions, when it comes to hiring young trans folk, providing pipelines for people to have jobs and careers? Are we doing enough for affirmative outreach? Looking at your own company's health insurance plans, do you have exclusions on transgender care? Do you have, if not outright exclusions, a lack of affirmative provision for coverage of different kinds of care? Do you have non-discrimination policies? Are you supporting your non-binary employees? Like there are so many ways in which transgender and gender non-conforming and gender non-binary people have to do all of this invisible emotional labor in order to succeed in the workplace, right? And ways that they will feel like they are maybe causing friction, are being a problem, are going to be labeled as troublemakers. It's so emotionally exhausting. And if you can be an ally to that, if you can think about how you can help trans people thrive everywhere around you, that's so critically important.
Yeah, and so that's just a personal plea right now. Like there's a lot of folks, there's 20 folks on this call. We all work somewhere. You all are in a community somewhere. You can actually commit today to making a difference in trans people's lives by just kind of being a good ally and showing up in solidarity and doing all the emotional labor so that they don't have to, or at least be there to support. That's my personal thing. But I want to talk more now about your kind of new role here with the Harvard LGBTQ plus advocacy clinic. Like, wow, how did that start? And like, did you just go up to them and say, hey, Harvard, can you like make this happen? Like you haven't had that happen before. And can you tell that story a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. So actually, I think it's a really good example of the power of organizing, because in a really small kind of way, I was inadvertently responsible for creating the job that I have now. When I was a student at the law school, I was on the Lambda student group committee, and we were petitioning the administration because there wasn't somebody who regularly taught a course in gender identity and sexual orientation in the law. And we said, look, like you keep getting visitors, they teach us sporadically. It doesn't seem like the administration is taking this seriously. We are students who are, important to this law school, and we want there to be representation, and we want to learn about this area of the law. It was during the time of like Windsor and Obergefell, and there were so many eventful things happening, and there was nobody who was regularly teaching this course, right? And of course, Harvard being Harvard, they said, well, we don't tenure people just because students want to. They have to be good enough for us. So we're not going to do that. And so then we said, okay, well, if you won't do that, then how about starting some kind of LGBT clinic? Right. And so I wasn't really primarily responsible for this. I don't want to take credit. It was really several other members of the committee who were involved in campus advocacy who did a lot of work to interview a bunch of, other clinical programs, interview the few LGBT programs that existed, interview, nonprofit groups like LGBTQ legal advocates and defenders in Massachusetts, and understand, what is the need, what could a model look like. And they gave like a 30+ page proposal to the administration, which was then sat upon, but they revived that ask every single successive year until there was a new dean that came in, and the new dean decided that he wanted to make this a priority, and they started the program. But at the time when I was nominally involved in this advocacy effort, I had no idea that that would actually bear fruit. But really, like, this clinic exists because students asked for it to exist, and they said this is something that we want to see and it's important.
Wow, that's amazing. So what is the future of LGBTQ advocacy?
Oh, easy. Yeah, easy question.
Easy question, because you're literally at Harvard now leading this clinic, and I mean,
yeah.
you have
That's a great question. And so I think, and part of the reason I was excited to take on this role, which I've now been in for just over a year and a half, is that I thought that, being housed in an academic institution does allow you to take a little bit of a different view on the work than if you're in a nonprofit sector. I think when you're in the nonprofit sector, there's kind of annual budgets, there's, trying to get money from foundations, there's trying to get money from donors. And of course, it's not that I have no strings on what I can do at HLS, but I think that the institutional imperatives are a little bit different, and there's a little bit more of an ability to think medium to long term about what we ought to work on. And also part of the reason that I was excited was that, I think that, the ability to use this particular institutional platform to give legitimacy to issues that are still more outside the mainstream, right? So I can talk a little bit about, how I see, we have some mission values that we use to kind of determine what projects we take on. I can give some examples of those projects. So broadly speaking, there's 3 substantive aspects to what we look at to see if this is something that we want to take on with our limited capacity, right? So basically, we look at, does this issue disproportionately affect LGBTQ people of color? Does this issue disproportionately affect transgender, gender non-binary, gender non-conforming, or intersex people? And does this issue speak to, and this is a little bit more nebulous, but does it address sort of looking at LGBTQ plus people as whole people who aren't just like, adult economic actors who can all like move to the city and like just live like it's will and grace, but really like people who have all these other identities and these other ties, right? Geographic, faith-based, ethnic, communal, like people who are young, people who are old, people who have families, people who have siblings and loved ones. We can't just say it's going to get better, just move to a city. We have to meet people where they are. We have to say, if you want to thrive in Clayton County, Georgia, we want to help you thrive there. And so I also look at that factor of, is it speaking to that kind of, that sort of like multifaceted aspect in which people have multiple identities and they want to be supported where they are. So those are the 3 kind of like substantive criteria that we use to determine what kind of projects we're working on. And as a couple of examples of the kinds of work that we're doing, a lawsuit that, a demand letter that we just came out with in public a couple of weeks ago is in a case called Bucci, and it involves 3 young transgender people who were all arrested in Miami last year for engaging in different like Black Lives Matter protests or Black Trans Lives Matters vigils, where they were basically like headled by the police, arbitrarily arrested on charges that were later dropped for things like obstructing a sidewalk, and then they had to, they were booked into the local county jail, and they had to spend overnight in this county jail where they were treated really awfully because they're transgender, right? They were, like harassed by the guards. They were called demeaning names. They were treated differently or segregated from the other people. They were, asked if they were sex workers, right? Like, so just a range of very like invasive and demeaning and humiliating actions against them. And so we've partnered in that case with the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund and the Southern Poverty Law Center. And we've come public with a demand letter to the mayor of the county saying, look, like, you don't have any, you, even to the extent that you have any policies about how you treat transgender people in the prison systems that you have, they are woeful, and jail systems, they are woefully deficient. And they aren't even following the policies that they do have. Right? It is just a disaster zone out there, as everybody knows, for transgender people who are in carceral systems. So that's a case that we're working on. We're also working on another case with the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is about the way that trans folks are treated in the homeless shelters of a major metropolitan city. It's a case that involves plaintiffs that both are transgender and also in some cases have disabilities or other healthcare needs, and the way that they are being abused, sexually abused, demeaned, harassed, humiliated, denied access to medical care within those systems, right? We have people involved in this lawsuit who, for example, were able to get access to gender affirming care, but then were unable to access the kinds of things they needed to safely and privately dilate, and therefore now require corrective surgery because they weren't able to get those services while they were in the homeless system. We've had people who were sexually assaulted by shelter staff or physically assaulted by shelter staff, who are chased out of shelters by staff with a baseball bat, right? So just like really unbelievably awful fact patterns that are just reminiscent of what happens when, people know that transgender people are at the bottom of society's pyramid and you can treat people like this and they can get away with it, right? And that's really the problem. There's a culture of impunity in these systems where people think these are vulnerable people who we can target and we can make the butt of our frustration or our anger or our amusement, and there's nobody that's going to defend them. So that's kind of some of the types of cases that we're trying to take on that are looking more at these structural systemic problems that are not going to just be solved by having a facial policy saying you can't discriminate against transgender people. You have to look at, does that policy actually have any impact on the way that people are experiencing life on the ground? And then, on the legislative side, we're engaging in some work that I'm really excited about that I think can sort of reach sort of more kind of like new issues. So one of our partnerships is with Interact, Advocates for Intersex Youth, which is the world's leading intersex advocacy organization. And we've been partnering with them to sort of help them develop and promulgate legislation that would end the practice of performing non-consenting genital surgeries on intersex infants, which is still legal in every state in America, even though it's been condemned as a form of torture by the United Nations and leads to lifelong trauma from intersex people who were operated on without their consent as children and don't find out about it until, in many cases, many years later. And another project that I'm very excited about, especially because it has a Northern California component, is that we have partnered with the APA Division 44 Committee on Consensual Non-Monogamy and Chosen Family Law Center to work on advancing the rights of polyamorous people and multi-parent and multi-partner families. So we've formed an organization called the Polyamory Legal Advocacy Coalition, and we've been involved in passing domestic partnership ordinances in 3 different cities in Massachusetts, Somerville, Cambridge, and Arlington, where people for the first time ever in the United States are able to get domestically partnered with more than one person. That work has excited a lot of interest around the country from people who are in this community. I think it's very LGBT related because LGBTQ plus people are more likely to be in non-traditional relationship forms, because I think, the experience of questioning heterosexuality causes you to question a lot of other aspects about traditional relationship forms. But when people are in these types of partnerships, there's a lot of ways in which our system of exclusive monogamy makes life difficult. Part of it is just open discrimination, people being afraid to be open about who they love and who they're in relationship with because they're afraid of keeping their jobs. They're afraid of what neighbors will think. They're afraid of housing discrimination, employment discrimination, education discrimination. But also, we've been hearing ever since we started doing this work a lot of really moving stories about just people being unable to support each other, right? Unable to sort of get health insurance for a loved partner, being unable to do things like visit people in the hospital. And so that work has generated a lot of momentum. We're also now working on passing non-discrimination ordinances that would protect against discrimination on the basis of what we're calling relationship status, and that would protect not just poly folks but also lots of other people within the sort of LGBTQ plus umbrella, including ARO, ACE, Kinky, and that kind of thing. And so the way it's related to Northern California is that actually on June 15th we are going to be holding a Northern California organizers meeting where we're going to be bringing together a lot of organizers in that space to come together to start working on passing similar types of legislation on the West Coast.
Wow. So sounds like you have your hands full, Alex. We're reaching almost 7 o'clock, and I want to make sure we talk about our queer and trans, Asian and Pacific Islander movement building work. And just to recap and welcome folks who have just joined us. Maybe you missed the beginning. We're in the middle of the first ever QTAPI week, QTAPI week, here in San Francisco. I was actually as lead organizer was helping to draft the resolution, and it's people were kind of amazed that someone took the effort to make it a resolution to go through the board of supervisors and declare it, because why should we ever declare something like a QTAPI week? But it was important for us to do it during the last week of May, and actually it kicked off on Harvey Milk Day on May 22nd, his birthday. He would have been 91, and I think it was a fitting celebration to start in the Castro and Harvey Milk Day, to kick off this new kind of pride celebration, QTAPI Pride. But we kind of talked earlier and in preparing for this call, but just kind of like, can I ask about this idea of bringing forth identities and focusing on trans Asians, that the focus of, because I feel like it's there because of the whole Stop Asian Hate issues, and we were sort of invisible before, and now it's sort of how do you feel about How do you feel about being so visible now? Like,
Yeah, no, it's funny that you say that, because I think I've been thinking about that a lot recently, right? And it's almost like a little bit depressing, actually, that like LGBTQ plus people have always been in the API community. The API community has always been a part of America. And, our activism goes back, centuries. And, they were really important early pioneering, Asian activists who were involved in things like, like the yellow black, coalition during the Black Panther era. And, in the like San Francisco, especially, from the 70s onwards, there's been this integral Asian involvement in, LGBT activism, pioneering people like Mia Yamamoto and Cecilia Chung have been around for a long time, right? And yet that has been given very little recognition by the mainstream society. And I think that, we don't teach the history of Asian people in this country. We don't teach the history of LGBT people in this country. And so there's this kind of like reinscribed visibility. People keep having to be pioneers again and again and again, because people aren't taught about who came before, right? And so I'm so glad that there is this opportunity now to spotlight the leadership that's happening in our community. Has been happening all this time. It's also a little bit difficult to recognize that it's only happening because of this wave of violence, and that's very depressing. But at the same time, better late than never. And if it causes there to be some good visibility, then I think it's an opportunity and we should engage with it. In terms of my own kind of identity, I think that I think I occupy two different identities that in the United States have been really invisibilized, right? One is transgender masculinity, which, unlike, being trans feminine, has been something which is, I think that there's the curse of hypervisibility and then the curse of hyper invisibility, where, on the one hand, you can be sort of a lightning rod and a focus of violence and harassment because you're so visible. And on the other hand, you're so invisible and people don't even recognize that you exist. And therefore, nobody ever thinks about the fact that you exist, and there's no role models and there's no way in which you're considered a public policy, right? And I think similarly, now occupying the world as an Asian man, I think I'm very aware that there are all these stereotypes about, East Asian men and, the role that they play in American society. And, I think that, for example, one thing that I notice is that when I lived in Asia and 90% of my classmates were Asian, I never heard any Asian woman ever say, "Oh, I'm not interested in Asian men." Everybody had a pinup of like a Canto pop star or a K-pop star or a J-pop star. They were Mando pop, all of these like, like boys with, their like shonen hair, and all of this, right? But you come to America and I hear Asian women say that to me as an Asian man. And I'm like, what on earth are you even saying? You're totally affected by who is visible in our culture. You're taught who to sort of aspire to a certain kind of lifestyle, to a certain kind of whiteness. Mm-hmm. And so I think my lived reality is kind of having multiple identities like that people perceive to be not sort of visible, and to not be sort of identities that people relate with stepping into leadership. And so I think the curse of being in that role is it's being a minority. You can never 100% divorce yourself from having some awareness of that, right? You have this double consciousness. I think that Frantz Fanon, who is the famed, post-colonial African theorist, had a book called, and I'm gonna get the name wrong, but it's something like, black skin, white masks, or Black Mask, White Fit. But the essential, I'm sorry, I mangled it. It's been years since I've read it. But essentially the sort of purpose of that book, right, is to talk about how, you have this consciousness of always knowing how other people see you. And also a consciousness of sort of the fact that you can never escape a stereotype. So one of my mentors at the law school is Jeannie Sue Gerson, who's the first Asian American woman to ever receive tenure at Harvard Law School. She's Korean American, and she wrote a really moving essay in the New Yorker about kind of like the role of stereotyping in Asian American identity, and how, she was very aware as she was going through all these elite spaces that, people constantly said things to her like, "Oh, you're not like those other Asians, because you're creative and you're musical and you're literary." And right. And it's like, okay, so either you defy the stereotypes and then people use them to confirm the stereotype anyway, because then they're like, you're not like the other ones. The other ones are definitely like that. Or you conform to the stereotype and then they're like, oh yes, just like I expected, you're conforming to the stereotype. So there's really no way to get out of it. There's really no way to win in some way if those are the kinds of things that are always in the back of your mind. So you kind of have to simultaneously be aware that they're true and also kind of live your life like they're not true. Yeah. So I think that's just kind of this challenge of being a minority that is always there. And then the other thing that I've always been aware of is, really wanting to resist, to resist the kind of stereotypical notions that like white America is really invested in believing about our communities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just give one example of that. When I was in law school, part of the reason I was able to ultimately pursue public interest is that I won a prestigious fellowship called the Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship for New Americans, which is open to people who are either immigrants or the children of immigrants, and they're going to graduate school to do something beneficial to society. And it's actually very cool because it's not just lawyers, it's also like, like doctors and engineers and scientists and theater people and journalists, right? So there's a big range to what they see as like improving American society. But I distinctly remember, I was really careful. And so, of course, it was one of the first times when I had to kind of really write about my experience with parents who were immigrants and my own identity and not just talk about the queer part of it. Because, just like the way that we do social justice work is so balkanized in this country, right? So it's often not asked for you to integrate these things. But, I remember, trying to think about how to write about how that that experience informed my desire to do this LGBT work. And I was really careful in my essays and application materials and interviews to not reinforce a narrative that there was some kind of clash between my Chinese cultural heritage and my LGBTQ plus identity, right? I really resisted that narrative because, I just thought that it was a really oversimplification of my lived experience, which is, of course, that, on some levels, I did have some challenges with my family. It wasn't always roses, but I don't know that I had a harder time with my family than I would have if I had a white family, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, I think there were certain ways in which, it might have been easier. And so I think that I was really not trying to tell that story. But I remember I got the fellowship, and then there was supposed to be a little blurb about me that they were going to put in the brochure, and they wrote, I don't know who wrote it, and I don't know where they got it, but they wrote, the first line was torn between his Chinese heritage and his LGBTQ plus identity, Alexander Chen, blah, 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 blah. And I wrote them back and I said, okay, hold on. Where did you get that from? Because that's not in anything I wrote. And I absolutely do not agree with that characterization of my lived experience, but it's like they saw what they expected to see, and what they wanted to hear is that minorities and communities of color are more bigoted than white communities, even though that is not necessarily true at all. And there are ways in which different communities can be more supportive, and they are more family oriented, and they have stronger family values, and that kind of gets you through difficult spaces. But that is not the story they want to hear, right? They really want to hear a story that enables them to believe that America's dominant majoritarian values are superior to the values of people who are newer to this country, or who they perceive to be newer to this country. And so I, think that has been a really strong aspect of it, is that I'm always really careful to not give oxygen to those narratives because people so desperately want to hear them. And I want to showcase the more complex and broader range of these experiences, and to say that there's a lot of diversity and complexity within our communities, and there are a lot of beautiful ways in which we hold together and we celebrate each other. And I want to figure out how can we bring forth that aspect of our identity and not make it this kind of, either this kind of flattened stereotype notion of, communities that are more bigoted, or this kind of like united colors of blended diversity where there's no difference in our cultural experience. And the only difference is that we're like a slightly different shade of melanin. But you can bring us in and everything's going to stay exactly the same.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And I love your idea of that, because there is a narrative that, some people want to just have a narrative of you, and it's kind of up to us to sort of disrupt that narrative. Like, what is this right here is what a patent attorney looks like right now. This is what, I'm a big law person. I was in-house. This is also me as Juicy. We're disrupting kind of stereotypes, disrupting the narrative of a good Asian. What does that even mean? I can't not ask this question, but we just passed yesterday the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. And I was wondering if you could talk about, and there was this great conversation at the Commonwealth Club with Michelle Meow yesterday as part of QTAPI week, with talking about Black and Asian and Pacific Islander solidarity, along with trans solidarity, and just the whole movement, and building solidarity, and like finding the liberation, that my liberation is tied to your liberation. That's how I identify solidarity. But what role do you think that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have in LGBTQ movement, in all social justice movement, in all marginalized communities? What is our role? I mean, speaking on AABA, because we're here talking to AABA.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I think that when I'm talking about doing this work on disrupting these narratives and not sort of buying into these systems, that's work that we all have to do within ourselves, right? It's really, I think it's impossible for minorities to escape the same kinds of racial and racist logics that permeate the entirety of American society simply by virtue of having some different lived experiences. And the truth of the matter is that if you look at American history, the core of American history is anti-Blackness, right? And it's a system that was founded on slavery and settler colonialism and the erasure of Black and Indigenous peoples. And so you can't get away from that in understanding what the role of any other racial minority is in America, because essentially what happens is that if every single successive ethnic minority comes to this country and they define themselves against Blackness, right? They all used to be lower on the racial hierarchy, whether it was Irish or Italian or Jewish folks, and they all sort of assimilated into whiteness. And you're seeing that happen right now with Latinos, right? There's this kind of idea of, oh, the emerging Democratic majority, because there's this, going to be this enduring shift because they're all Latino, and if they're Latino, they're going to vote Democratic. But what you're seeing actually in the census data is that decade on decade, they're defining themselves more as white. And I think that functionally, if you look at economic data, if you look at education data, if you look at, employment data, Asian Americans are starting to occupy that profile as well. And so we have a decision, and we have a decision for each of us and as a community of, are we going to assimilate and buy into a system of anti-Blackness where we benefit marginally from stepping on other people so that we can get a little bit higher? And especially where we feel like we want to do that because we have a lot of economic precarity in this country and we don't have a good social security net. And because our families came from places a lot of the times where there wasn't a good social safety net. So there's sometimes just this feeling of like, we got to get ours, and who cares about other people's problems? We have to take care of ourselves, right? And so I think that we do have an obligation as we sort of think about, how are we being weaponized in the ongoing anti-Blackness of this country? How are we allowing our community to become used in this age-old battle about what is justice and what is fairness and what is equality and what is equality of opportunity in this country? I think that we really have a responsibility to recognize that we should not play this handmaiden role in upholding white supremacy, and that is already happening. And that is sometimes something that's happening within ourselves, and it's something that's happening in the broader community. And I think that, there may be a cynical question of like, well, what's in it for us? Like, isn't it better to be approximate to whiteness? Because being proximate to whiteness means being closer to the good schools and not being treated as badly as Black people are treated. And I think that really the answer I have about that is we're never going to break out of this system of scarcity and fear without breaking down and dismantling anti-Blackness, because anti-Blackness is the root of a lot of the other systemic inequality that we see in our country, whether it's the carceral system, whether it's segregation in education, whether it's lack of economic opportunity, whether it's lack of investment. It all comes out of these racist logics that have sustained the framework that we've had for so long. And Asian people have a stake in that as well, because there's a lot of erasure and pain and psychic cost to pretending that there isn't something unique about ourselves and about our heritages, and about not recognizing that we have more to gain in terms of transforming our society by allying ourselves with the people who are the most disadvantaged rather than the people who have the most power, right? And so, yes, we could ape this proximity to whiteness, but it comes at a lot of psychic and emotional cost. And I think especially as attorneys and as a lot of people who have families who maybe came from a certain kind of background that said, who cares what you want? You need to be able to put a roof over your head. So, we're here to make you safe. And they said, we're here so that you can have a different kind of life. But also what they're teaching us at the same time is you can't have a different kind of life because you have to hold on for all your worth for everything we've got, because they could slip away at any moment. And so we just have to keep doing this for the next generation. And it's like, at what point are we the next generation? At what point are we going to do something different? Are we going to aspire to fuller lives? Because that's what our families work so hard for us to get, even if that means that the vision of what we want to do with that is not necessarily what they could have recognized at the time, right?
Yeah. I mean, I heard it yesterday, and just to sum it up, we have to stop investing in white supremacy. Like, you just can't do that. And so when you invest in the model minority myth, you're investing in white supremacy. Period.
Right. And why are we doing things like allowing, conservative legal groups to divide us on issues like affirmative action when, the impact of things like legacy and sports admissions is much higher than, how many Asian people or Black and brown people are fighting for the scraps at the bottom of the barrel, right? And so why are we allowing them to divide us in this way when the more pernicious effects are from wealth and privilege?
Yeah. And with that, I want to thank you for this conversation. We are going to open it up to question and answer from the audience. And I actually saw Alex Mabanta ask a question: which trans leaders give you the most hope or have challenged, taught you the most?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that since this is a QTAPI event, I do want to sort of like spotlight some of the API queer leaders that have really had a big impact on my own life. So, firstly, I think, I mentioned some of them earlier, some, trailblazing folks in the Bay like Miyama Yamamoto and Cecilia Chung. But then I think within the legal sphere, there is kind of this emerging generation of trans leadership, right? We now have trans leaders at the helm of two of the three major trans rights organizations in the country, Chris Hayashi and now Andy Mara at TILDEF. That gives me a lot of hope. I think I went to NCLR because I went to the NCAPIA National Conference and met two attorneys who are Asian at the same LGBT organization, Kathy Sakamura, the deputy director, and Ming Wang, the supervising helpline attorney. And I said, there's an organization on the national level that has more than one Asian attorney. That's amazing, right? So I think that representation really made me feel like I could be part of this tradition of, Asian LGBT folk contributing to our collective liberation. And I think that's been a really important part of being able to see myself in the work.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And I love Ming. We went to law school together. We were same. Howard asks, is there a larger national strategic path / plan to win trans rights similar to HRC with gay marriages? And also, do timelines get delayed given the current Supreme Court?
So I'm going to do a very law professor thing and challenge the premise of the question, which is that there was a national larger strategic plan to win gay marriage that was spearheaded by HRC. I mean, I think, look, it's much more complicated than that. Like when you get behind the curtains, I think there's this view that there's some kind of like cabal that gets behind the room and they smoke the gay equivalent of cigars, or whatever. And then, they make these decisions like, I don't know, like smoking rainbow cigarettes or something. And it's both true and not true, right? There is a number of sort of organizations that have been around for, at this point, 40 to 50 years that have had a leading role, NCLR being one of them, in sort of shaping the national landscape of LGBT rights. But, the path was never really that certain or that clear from the get-go, right? I was recently just in Hawaii, sheltering in place there, which was a really lovely experience, and learned a lot about Hawaii's singular history when it comes to LGBT rights. That in the 1993, their court was the first one in the country to say that it was unconstitutional to prevent people from getting married who were same-sex, and that was actually what sparked the first wave of DOMA in the late 90s. Litigation, right? And so after that, there was a huge backlash and people thought, oh, we've lost marriage for a generation. And then, there were then the sort of the second wave got kickstarted in 2003 with the Goodrich decision, which GLAAD litigated in Massachusetts. And then that sparked, a wave of sort of like copycat lawsuits. And then, in California, after the ruling, there was Prop 8, right? So there's been this kind of like ebb and tide the entire time, even with just marriage alone, aside from ongoing, longstanding questions about, is marriage what we should be focusing on? Versus employment rights, versus education, versus, social change, versus hate crimes legislation, versus, more of an emancipatory politics, right? And so like, there's always been these fights going on. And when you look at anything that happens, it never happens overnight. It always happens because people were working on it for a really long time. Yeah. We have BOSAC because people have been working for 40 plus years to guarantee employment protections, and they were trying it multiple different ways. That's why we're still trying to pass the Equality Act, even though BOSAC was decided, because there are still some provisions that are affected by the Equality Act that BOSAC didn't address, like public accommodations, right? And so I think that part of it is recognizing that you kind of have to work on multiple priorities at the same time, so that you have to play defense and offense at the same time. You can't just let the other side set the agenda, and you have to kind of build the relationships, and you have to try out the strategy, and you have to figure out the messaging and the legal aspects like along the way. And I think one of the biggest challenges has always been resources. This is actually a pretty small movement considering how much is accomplished, and there's always these disputes about when it is right to do something or not do something. And I think it's easy to criticize that from the outside, and also it's always less intentional than it looks from the outside, right? I think afterwards, the producers come in and they make movies, and the movies they give credit to like two people for something that like 500 other people did, and those two people maybe weren't even very central to the effort, but then they get told to be the heroes, right? And so I think one thing that I've learned is there's almost no relationship between who actually did something and who gets credit for it. And there are always so many more people that only the people who are actually on the inside understand were really integral to it that aren't going to be celebrated, right? And so you kind of have to recognize on some level, I think, that there's a way in which we're just very bad as a society in understanding complex social change and telling a good nuanced story about it. But it does kind of everybody a disservice, because then everybody thinks that doing social change work is about being a hero and being lionized and getting an HBO show made about you, rather than being a hero probably means you did one piece of the work that a lot of other people contributed to, and then you went home and you had dinner. and people don't really remember who you are anymore, right? And so I think that's the reality of what it looks like. So this is a very long way of saying that when it comes to trans rights, that I think it's the same thing that's going on right now, right? There's these ongoing disputes within the community about, okay, so we definitely have to fight this legislation that's happening right now, but should we have challenged the transgender military ban? Or should we have let it stand? You know, should we be working more on decarceration? Should we be working on sex work? Should we be working on access to gender affirming care? Should we be working on youth? Should we be working on international issues? And you know, I think that those arguments are happening, and I think there's progress being made. And after the progress is made, which is something that is both within and not within our control, we can control what we decide to work on, but then there's also the other side and what they're working on. There's also the national political environment. There's just things that are, you know, there's cultural change. There's like what Hollywood decides is going to be important. And all of these things are going to play a role in how, you know, hearts and minds are going to move, right? And that is going to then end up being a neat and tidy little story about how we advance trans rights. But when you're making the sausage, it's not that neat and tidy.
Yeah, I remember very clearly because I was going to law school and like seeing Prop 8, and you know I graduated around that time, and you know everything was happening, but and I went to Lavender Law, and Lavender Law, it was probably the closest thing to rainbow cigarettes in a room, and anybody in the movement is there talking about DOMA, talking about, you know, marriage equality, having all these conversations, but it was very much lots of voices in the room, like plenty of ways to get involved, even if you're not as, you know, civil rights lawyer. What would you say? And sorry, I'm going to ask Lucy's question after my question, because I'm going to use my privilege here. But what would you say to folks who are maybe not like working at nonprofit or civil rights lawyers, and maybe in the big law and the, you know, corporate background? Like, can they be effective also advocates or activists?
Yeah, and I saw somebody in the chat mentioned, you know, Lambda Legal, right? And yes, of course, there are, you know, a number of great organizations, including the ACLU, Lambda Legal, GLAD, NCLR, TILDEF, TLC, NCTE, you know, the state equality groups. There's a lot of organizations that do great work. And those are just the legal organizations. There's also all of the, you know, like there's the sort of GLADs and HRCs and sort of the more political organizations of the world. And there are also more trans-led organizations like here in the Bay Area, TGIJP, and they all do fantastic work at different levels. I would say that there's a huge dearth of I think the huge gap that we have is in enforcement work and in direct services, right? We really, as a movement, only have resources to do impact work, but so much of the need that's out there is actually enforcement and direct services. And I would really encourage you, if you're an attorney at a law firm, to sort of get involved through the pro bono practice and get a sense of how they determine how those cases are decided. There are organizations like TILDEF, for example, that have a name change project that always need more firms to be involved in. And there's such a need for like just basic legal services, right? Like, yeah, we've got Bostock now, but 95% of Title VII cases are lost by the plaintiff because we have this really crappy regime, and also because people can't get competent attorneys who understand LGBT issues and can speak to that, especially if there's an intersectional component of like there's both race discrimination and LGBT discrimination, or both sex discrimination and anti-gay discrimination, right? And so actually there's such a need for more services out there, and there's such an impact that can be had by pro bono in sort of getting involved in that. So I would strongly encourage all of you to sort of like think about how you're spending your pro bono hours and get involved in some of this work.
Awesome. And thank you for that, Alex. Lucy's question asks, how would you navigate performative allyship in an institution? They promise to change/do better, but it's all smoke and mirrors, or pressure you to do all the work and unfairly hold you accountable for things. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's funny that you ask this, and I suppose this is publicly recorded, so there are some things that I could say that I won't. But I will. What I will say is, yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that I always struggle with is how much to say something, how much to be that person on any given day. How is that going to impact my work environment or my society versus myself? I think the first thing to say is, like, give yourself a break. You know, like, you can't change everything overnight for everybody. And it's also not your job. And unfortunately, you know, you don't get to the top of a lot of these institutions by caring about those things. And you have to be pretty strategic and pretty shrewd and pretty political about how to do it. at the same time that if you don't ever stand up for anything, you totally don't even know how to do it anymore. You can't even recognize when you're supposed to, right? And so I think, doing kind of like things that are brave and hard, like real structural change, does require people to stick their necks out. And you kind of have to like exercise that. It's like a muscle. Like the more you do it, the more you're like, oh, I see. This is one of those times I should say something. I should draw the line here.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't make it that day, don't beat yourself up about it too much, because who's going to sleep at night and sleeping perfectly fine? All the people who don't give an F about that are sleeping just fine, and the next day they're going to go to work and they're going to perform well. And you also have to kind of keep up on those metrics to get taken seriously in this deeply hierarchical profession. And so I would say, like, practice self-care. Make sure you establish some distance between yourself and work. Make sure to remember that it's not all on you, and try to say something every once in a while when you do think it's important, because I think if you don't do it at all, you're totally going to forget. And I will say this, that like when I started this job, I was a little paranoid about whether or not people would want to work with me. I know that sounds ridiculous, but like, everyone has a little bit of imposter syndrome. And I was like, well, I'm really young and this is something new, and I don't know if we're going to be able to do anything with this job. My legal director said, don't worry about it, Alex, you're going to get plenty of work. And of course I didn't believe him. And I spent all of this, the whole of winter break kind of like sweating bullets about whether we would have collaborations. And then when I started reaching out to people in the movement about collaborating with the organization, and at this point we have collaborations with virtually every movement in the organization in the movement, what people said to me is, we want to work with you because you have spoken up, because at, conferences and roundtables and events, you have been the person who has said, we don't have enough trans representation on this issue, or we need to think about structural racism in our movement. We need to think about retention. We need to think about hiring. We need to think about the pipeline. And at the time, every single time I did that, I was really, really afraid to do it. Because I thought, well, I'm really young and I'm so junior, and I could get blackballed from this movement if I criticize, the people who are in power. And there's a systemic problem within the LGBT rights movement of, the older folks in the movement stay for a really long time, have a lot of longevity. They're great at what they do, but they're overwhelmingly white and cis, right? And there's this constant churn of Black and brown younger associates and attorneys who are coming in, they're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in year one, and in year three, they look like they've given up, and you might as well just throw them in the middle of the highway because they don't even care anymore, right? And it's like, it's very sad and depressing. We have chewed up and spit out so many Black, brown, and trans folks in this movement. It's horrible, and I was like, that's not going to be me, but if I say something, is it going to be me? Right? But actually, when I started this, a lot of the people who have collaborated with me are people who are Black, brown, and trans, and who stuck their necks out and said, I want to work with Alex because what he's doing is important, and this is the future, and we have to do this work, right? And so it's worth it. You don't have to just build allies from white people. You don't have to just look for power from above. It's really important to think about the collective power that you have at your peer level, and the level of like caring about people who are junior to you, whether that's law students, whether that's legal workers, whether it's paralegals, right? Actually, if you sustain a hierarchical system, if you implicitly accept that you're going to get treated better than other people because you're more senior or you're more prestigious, that never doesn't redound upon you too. You're upholding that system of deep hierarchy that is so embedded in the legal profession, and you have to start working on pushing yourself in order to become brave enough to change it. You have to exercise. It's like a marathon. You have to just do a little bit every day. Otherwise, you're never going to get there. But if you do, I promise you, you're going to be a happier person, because there's more to life than making partner or whatever it is that people care about.
Well, and thank you for that, Alex. Another question, and Ross Allen, I know Ross, hi Ross, asks for suggestions on how in-house lawyers can help. By the way, Bailiff is now partnering with Turnout to launch a queer nonprofit legal referral program. I think maybe Amanda can put into the chat, but it's just launched. So it's kind of a pilot thing that Bailiff is working on. I'm just transitioning out of Bailiff's board, but I'm still helping out with that. So that there are ways to help as far as that's concerned. But Alex, do you have any specific suggestions on how in-house lawyers can help?
Yeah, I can combine the answers to that with the other question somebody said about the impact enforcement distinction. So first of all, I'm not as familiar with like in-house structures and whether in-house corporations always have pro bono practices, but I don't really see any reason why you can't do pro bono just because you're in-house. And a lot of law firms are transactional and they're not litigation, and a lot of the direct services work that you can do, things like name changes, for example, petitions, are not things that you need to be a litigation attorney to do, right? And in fact, like in some cases, like if you're a litigator, you don't necessarily have the like LGBT competence, right? So it's really not about whether you know how to litigate. It's really more about whether you have the competence to like work with these kinds of clients and do whatever is necessary. So I don't see a reason why in-house folks couldn't also be more involved in that. And I think maybe there's just less of a culture of doing it as part of your hours. In with respect to the impact enforcement distinction, so impact litigation is where you take a case for very strategic reasons to change a particular part of the law, right? And cases like Obergefell and Bostock are impact cases, and all of the cases that are going to be challenging these anti-trans bills are all impact cases, right? You're picking politically sympathetic plaintiffs who have the right kinds of facts so that you can set up a certain kind of legal question cleanly for a court to decide. Enforcement work is when the legal principle is clearly established, but you still need to actually defend people, because just because it's on the books doesn't mean that people are going to follow it or people don't actually get mistreated, right? Bostock only means you have some kind of right of action if somebody discriminates against you. It doesn't mean you're not going to get discriminated against. And the reality is that just because you have a facial protection on the books doesn't mean that people don't experience a lot of discrimination. And a lot of people have a deep problem with getting representation because, their cases are not these clean impact cases, or the proposition of law has already been established, but they've still been discriminated against. And so there is a massive need for more just representation of people in employment law, education law, different kinds of anti-discrimination, healthcare discrimination, family law. Like there are so many areas where people don't think that they can do something, but actually just being an attorney, you can probably help. And so I think that these referral services that people are talking about in the chat are great resources to look at, because actually, like, anybody who is already a licensed attorney can pick up a sideline in another area of law, even if their personal area of expertise is like, I don't even know, multinational contracts or something like that. You can maybe help some struggling Black and brown owned businesses or queer owned businesses who don't have, legal advice on how to handle, their contracts, or who don't know how to handle their tax situation, right? If you're a tax attorney. So there's all these different ways that you can be creative about how you can use your existing skill set to help people who need that kind of competency.
Great. Well, I've asked a lot of questions of you, Alex. Do you have any questions of me? Just throwing it out there. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, Juicy, I'd love to hear from you about, I guess, how do you feel like those of us who are doing this work, civil rights work on the front lines, how can we be better at thinking about integrating, about being more creative about the way that we are advancing social justice work in the QTAPI space, right? Like, I think we can be very like locked in on like, we litigate and we legislate, and it can be very like esoteric and kind of like very like in the weeds. But I think that I struggle with that because I feel like, most of the reason we're succeeding as a movement is really just about social change and representation and changing hearts and minds, including the hearts and minds of politicians and judges. And I don't know that we do a good enough job of bridging that gap and of talking about these things in a way that can kind of cross that divide. So what could we be doing as a movement to be more effective at tying in with community organizers and with social conversations and with political conversation in media?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're doing it right now. I mean, I'm kind of, I've been the leader of GAPA, so it's the GLBTQ plus Asian Pacific Alliance. It's a 501c4 organization started in 1988, really just because they want a small group of gay and bi Asian men wanted, Asian and Pacific Islander men wanted to sort of create safe spaces for themselves, and just back in 1988. And it has now grown and changed and evolved into a bigger organization to try to really see a powerful queer and trans Asian and Pacific Islander community that is seen, heard, and celebrated. And I only spout out the vision statement because it reminds me that it's power and visibility. And what you just said was representation, changing hearts and minds, politics. So that's, to me, what is power? That's building your politics. Like that's actually movement building. That's seeing each other, community building. That's power building, really. That's organizing. Community organizing is power, basically. And visibility is just sort of like see our issues, see us and hear us and celebrate us as whole human beings. And I think that's what we're doing today. Alex, you're talking about all the amazing work that you do, all the amazing movement work, the really hard, nitty-gritty impact litigation that needs to be done. But then you're also able to explain it to a more lay audience who may not be lawyers. And I encourage all the lawyers or future lawyers here in this audience to sort of learn to become the go-betweens between these community-based organizations like GAPA and legal organizations like AABA, because like lawyers specifically have like a really powerful role in society in explaining the legal things, like the way that, you know, the world is functioning, I guess, through society, or how we decided it to do, you know, make the law so, or whatever, and explain those real life impact, what it really happens to the person in Clinton County, Georgia, for example, or, you know, you actually can help explain what's going on and why there's injustice in the world. You know, and anyway, any lawyer can do that pretty much. And actually lay folks who are not lawyers can do that too. So you just kind of get to learn the vocabulary of it all. I think is that a good answer, Alex? I don't know.
Yeah, and I guess maybe a follow-up question I have for you is I'm just kind of curious, you know, do you think that our movement is doing a good enough job of inspiring people in the QTAPI community to feel like we're working on issues that are relevant to them? And if not, what could we be doing to make people feel like we are speaking to the needs of the community?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to bring up an amazing organization, API Equality Northern California, APINC, and they're really a trans and gender nonconforming Asian and Pacific Islander, like really focused organization on that, building power. And they just did a needs assessment of the first ever needs assessment of TGNC Asians and Pacific Islanders. Went over 2 years. It's called the Up to Us campaign, and GAPA was a partner in that. But basically, they interviewed folks and really got a sense of what do TGNC Asian and Pacific Islanders need. And one of the main things that came out of that report is that like they need more spaces like this, like more spaces where they can be fully seen and heard and celebrated. Those spaces are not just luxury items; those are actually essential for survival. And so that's actually one of the main reasons why we started this QTAPI week, because it's like, oh, we just need more people. I didn't actually know that it was so important, but I mean, like, okay, so important. Let's make more spaces like that. Also, we need. They actually responded over like around half of the respondents said that they don't feel like they can influence government decisions. And when I was like, half? Really? Because like that was like, let me just show you how I can influence. We're gonna have a whole week. We're gonna call it, you know, and it's actually just to understand like how to do that. It's actually working with your supervisor or a representative in city hall or Congress or wherever, you know, whatever level of government. But that kind of advocacy is actually not rocket science. You know, it's just that people just don't know how to do it. And maybe there could be a better, like, this is how you do this. Let's have it like there's an LGBT advocacy day that Equality California does, right? Once a year. We could do that for QTAPI like week. We could have a lobby day if we wanted. I mean, it's not impossible. Like, or you know, we could do different kinds of events that actually show exactly how you do these type of things. So you know, the biggest issue right now in the Bay Area, housing, of course, housing. We can have panels on housing. We have people in our community that are experts in this. There's a commissioner, Hans Howe, for the housing commissioner. He and I are talking about like how can we do more to sort of inspire folks to like, because these are real like nitty gritty issues, right? But then makes a huge difference, especially, you know, here in the Bay Area. I don't know. Does that answer the question? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I love that actually. And I do think that like, especially for API folks, right, you know, there is this kind of tradition of like not be as involved in politics, which I think both comes of a lot of us coming from our families coming from countries where like being involved in politics meant that you got your head cut off, right? Or, you know, publicly shamed on the factory floor or whatever, or re-educated. And then, you know, like as literally like many members of my family were forcibly re-educated during the Cultural Revolution, right? And so you coming out of that environment, right, there is this kind of sense of like, okay, let's not necessarily get involved in politics. And then I think, you know, that, you know, it's a whole civics education that we don't have in America of like, how do you get involved? And what that means is that you go to like the local school board meeting or the utility management meeting, and almost everybody who's there is white. Yep. Right. And every time you do any kind of issue-based advocacy, like you have to work so hard to affirmatively get people of color. Like right now in the Polyamory Legal Advocacy Coalition, that's one of the biggest problems we're having, which is that, you know, the people who feel the most safe and comfortable being vocal about it are usually white people. And so, you know, the people that are spokespeople and the people who are willing to talk about their story are all white. And so then, of course, it's going to influence who people think of as part of the community. And then when, you know, API people see poly people in the media, they're going to be like, well, I'm not poly because all poly people are like white people who live in Berkeley. Right. And so, you know, like this is just this reinforcing problem that happens with representation. And I think building that political education and building that power that people can have and saying, look, actually it does matter. And like, especially encouraging API people to be like, your voice is relevant. Your voice is important. You bring a perspective that isn't here right now. And we can help you find that voice, right? I think it's so critical to representation for this community. So I love that.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I also want to make sure we support you at Harvard. Like, what can we do that, like, to help make sure that the Harvard LGBTQ plus advocacy clinic survives and continues and is not endowed, right? Is that right, Alex?
Yeah, so thank you for asking about that. So yes, so this, because it was started as a pilot program a year and a half ago, at this point, in order for the program to sort of like continue and grow in perpetuity, really, what the program is looking for is very high net worth individuals who are able to give 7-figure donations that would endow my position and endow the clinic. And I think, lawyers are one of those categories of people who may know some people like that. And so if you know of anybody or of any sort of groups that you think would potentially be interested in giving that kind of support to this work, then please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. You can @ me in my Twitter, which is on my subject line, but also my email address is available on the Harvard faculty webpage. I think that kind of like sustained financial support is what so many initiatives that focus on marginalized communities often lack, right? And that's sort of kind of like the capital, right? Capital that means that you can sustain something indefinitely. That is what is lacking. And so people work so hard to, raise relatively small amounts of money compared to the amount of money that these philanthropic donations or huge institutions have. And then, they are not able to sustain that level of energy. They burn out and they're not able to sustain that work. And then people don't know about that work and that work is forgotten. And so I'm not cruising to have that happen to my program. And so I'm making the ask, if you know anybody who might be interested, or you think you can connect me to anybody who might be interested, I would be very interested in talking to them. And I would be very grateful for the support.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. And I know folks out there in AABA land, if you don't know about GAPA, check out gapa.org. Always looking for more members. It's an organization that is at a pivotal moment of, and I think that's just in general of our QTAPI community. We're just finally seeing our own power. And we're finally starting to recognize that we can actually move things forward. We are part of this huge fabric of America. We have a unique take on it, and it's time for our voices to be heard. So I want to thank you, Alex, for having this great conversation with me. I want to turn it back to Christina or Amanda if they want to say any last closing thoughts. But my final juicy thoughts is just like, add me on the Insta right there, Juicy Liu Realness. Or if you like my style of talking, find my podcast, and we'll talk more. But I gotta have you on my podcast too, Alex. Oh my gosh!
Thank you so much, Juicy. You were fabulous.
Yes. Thank you, Amanda. Go ahead, Christina.
Oh, I was just gonna say thank you so much to you both for this really amazing event. Alex, I really appreciated hearing all your wisdom and insights from all your movement work and your great work at the Harvard Clinic as well. And so this was just a really great chat. And I see that Amanda also put a plug in for our QTAPI brunch on June 25th. So put that on your calendars. We'll post some more details on that event soon. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining us at our event, and my sincerest appreciation and gratitude for both Juicy and Alexandra for hosting and putting on this amazing event for our membership.
Thanks all. And just one more plug is if you're in the Bay Area, in San Francisco Bay Area, there is a closing celebration of QTAPI Week on Saturday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. in the Castro, in the 18th and Collingwood parking lot behind the Walgreens. It's gonna be super cute. There's lots of DJs. I'm not gonna be in drag, but there's gonna be drag queens there. There's gonna be drag performers, drag king performance, part of our Bay Area. It's raising money for a lot of South Asian trans folks that are like being affected by COVID in India. And so we would love to have a big party. And this is community building and relational organizing. It's probably one of the most effective ways to get anything done. So thanks again. Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Alex. And goodbye. We're all done. Yay.